Okay, good afternoon. I'm Gershon Lewental, and it's a pleasure to be sharing this panel with two good colleagues of mine, one from Hebrew University and one from Ben-Gurion. We'll start with Daniel Lav, who's a lecturer in the Department of Arabic Language and Literature at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. After his BA studies at the University of Chicago, he completed an MA and PhD at the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at Hebrew University. His areas of research are Islamic theology with a particular emphasis on the Salafī tradition in Sunni Islam, from Ibn Taymiyyah in the 14th century to present-day Salafī movements. To date, his principal contributions to the research literature are two books on the intellectual history of Salafism, pre-modern and modern, Radical Islam and the Revival of Medieval Theology, published by Cambridge in 2012, and Salafī Political Theology, published by Cambridge just last year. So please, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Gershon, and thanks to the organizers of the conference and to all present. So I'll start with a little bit of background on the history of research and the topics that I research. It was more or less starting in the year 2001 and following the 9/11 attacks that the academic world, like the larger world beyond, evinced a great desire to understand who Al-Qaeda were and why they behaved as they behaved. And truth be told, we knew very little, so it was possible for all kinds of people to write more or less whatever they wanted, and usually in accordance with their already existing projects. So I don't mean to pick on anyone in particular, but then I saw that we're only two speakers in this panel, so I have some time. So a good example is a slim book titled Al-Qaeda and What It Means to Be Modern by the political philosopher John Gray of the London School of Economics. And as the description on the back flap reads, while many Americans view the September 11th terrorist attack as the act of an anachronistic and dangerous sect, one that champions medieval and outmoded ideals, John Gray instead argues that the ideology of Al-Qaeda is both Western and modern, a byproduct of globalization's transnational capital flows and open borders. Now, in Gray's defense, the specialist literature at this point in time was not much help, and he was misled. But even so, I believe it generally good policy to not write on topics that one does not understand. And that is so as not to write sentences such as, the intellectual roots of radical Islam are in the European counter-enlightenment. I'm not saying that it's completely disconnected, but that statement as written is not true. In point of fact, Al-Qaeda belonged then, and belongs now, to an originalist school of Sunni Islam known as Salafism, with a fairly definite pedigree in pre-modern Islam. The living religious authorities that Al-Qaeda accepted from its inception were radical Salafī scholars, first and foremost. Thus, when Osama bin Laden, although he personally has somewhat wider tendencies, but when he and the other original leaders of the incipient Al-Qaeda wanted a legal guide as to how to run their training camps in Afghanistan, they turned to an Egyptian by the name of Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, who was the religious authority for the Egyptian Jihad organization. That is the original organization of Ayman al-Zawahiri, and it is also the organization that in a previous incarnation assassinated President Sadat. So they turned to Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, who was likewise responsible for educating newly arrived Arab cadres in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Not all of them, but the more radical ones. Likewise, we could point to Abu Qatada al-Filistini, who from London provided patronage to the Algerian GIA organization in the 1990s. And he also was a radical Salafī. Both of them are among the founding fathers of the school that has come to be known as a Salafī al-Jihādiyya. That is the more radical wing of present-day Salafism. So it took some time to understand that the so-called ideology of Al-Qaeda sat at one extreme of a spectrum of views in a larger Sunni school and movement known as Salafism. Now, opposite them are many more Salafīs, that is, the non-jihadi Salafīs, as it were, are far more numerous than Salafī al-Jihādiyya, and they are opposed to Al-Qaeda and its methods. So these later Salafīs are often called in the literature Quietist Salafīs, meaning politically quietist. The best overall name for them is scholastic Salafīs, But for our purposes, since we're focusing in on their political quietism, then I will stick with the terminology of Quietist Salafīs. And in order to simplify matters for today's purposes, I will focus on one particular scholar and leader of the Quietist Salafī camp, Sheikh Muhammad Nasruddin al-Albani, henceforth al-Albani, meaning the Albanian, because he was born in 1914 in Albania, but spent his later childhood in Damascus before living out the later years of his life in Jordan until his death in 1999. And he was, along with two Saudi figures, those three together were sort of the great leaders of Quietist Salafism towards the end of the 20th century. For al-Albani and his students and followers in particular, the Quietist Salafī ethos is encapsulated in the slogan, "At-tasfiya wa tarbiya." I promise not to introduce too much Arabic today, but "At-tasfiya wa tarbiya," that is purification and education. So what do they mean by this slogan? Purification is above all purification of the hadith corpus, that is the collected traditions ascribed to the Prophet Muhammad. And whether it is a composite corpus or not, I mean corpus as I will describe in what follows. It's not for Salafīs, it's not a certain set of books, though for some other Sunni Muslims, they will say there are the 6 books, and there are 6 books which are the most widespread, but they aren't the only ones in which one can find authentic hadith, and vice versa. Not everything in them Salafīs consider to be authentic. So al-Albani was first and foremost a muhaddith, an expert in the traditional Islamic science of evaluation of these reports, ostensibly handed down from the Prophet Muhammad. And this science consists primarily of examination, analysis, and judgment on the chains of transmission of the said reports. That is, one starts from the latest transmitter and he says, I heard from, or so-and-so told me, and all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad. This science requires, traditional Islamic science requires extraordinary erudition in the biographies of the transmitters of hadith, of whom there are thousands, and various issues in the terminology used in the later transmission of the reports, and much else. That is just as far as evaluating the hadith themselves. Now, as for many Salafīs, but for al-Albani and his followers in particular, the distinction between study of hadith and the study of Islamic law, and even the distinction between study of hadith and the study of Islamic theology, dwindles down to almost nothing. In principle, all of law, creed, and practice are set out in the Quran and the hadith. This is their conception, and thus there is no reason and no license to look elsewhere. Scholars from other schools disagree with such a contention and regard it as simplistic, but al-Albani he liked this image of as though he were simplistic, and he kind of wore it as a badge of honor, though there's nothing simple about him at all. Now, the origins of this divergence stretch back to the earliest history of the development of Islamic law, as far as we can trace it, and relate to topics such as the probative value of the hadith. That is, does it in and itself yield yaqeen, or certain definite knowledge on legal matters, or does it only provide ghalaba zann, that is, preponderant evidence, which may indeed be determinative if it's preponderant, ceteris paribus, but which may also be countervailed by other sources or conditions or considerations where these exist. So why is the hadith corpus in need of purification? All agree, and it's not just an academic thing, this is a preoccupation of traditional Islamic scholarship. Everybody agrees that falsification of hadith, that is, false ascription of hadith to the Prophet, was an extremely widespread phenomenon in the early centuries of Islam. And also, apart from outright falsification, the traditional scholars likewise agree that there is a spectrum or a range of judgment on these traditions' ascription to the Prophet Muhammad, from dubious to undoubtedly authentic. Now, al-Albani's basic claim is that latter-day scholars have corrupted all of jurisprudence, theology, and practice in Islam due to insufficient attention to the hadith and the adoption in its stead of fallible forms of human reasoning. One of al-Albani's most important works is his multi-volume The Weak and Fabricated Hadith and Their Harmful Influence on the Islamic Nation. And as the title of this work indicates, it not only argues the inauthenticity of the traditions that it lists, but also their purported harmful effects. For example, he argues that the widespread tradition in which the prophet reputedly said, "Disagreement in my nation is a blessing," or "Disagreement among my nation is a blessing," ikhtilafu ummati rahma, he says that's completely fabricated. And it has led Muslims to falsely believe that disagreement, or one could say pluralism, is a blessing, whereas in truth, unity should be forged around the single truth of revelation to be clarified precisely by the path of purification. As an aside, as a doctoral student, I attended a one-day workshop in Exeter on Salafism, and the person who was in charge of moderating did not have a background in Salafī studies. He was an expert in Islamic philosophy, and so he said, "This is a different world for me," and I asked myself what happened to principles such as ikhtilaf ummati rahma, and almost everyone said immediately that a false hadith, hadith batil, doesn't exist. But that does serve to exemplify that it is in fact widespread, and many people are familiar with it, even if they don't have an especially advanced Islamic education. So that is as far as purification. The second principle, education, embodies the Quietist ethos. Once the Muslims have embraced true Islam, then the rest will follow. And as al-Albani says, actually quoting here a Muslim Brotherhood leader for more or less polemical purposes, but I'll leave that aside for now, "Build the Islamic State in your hearts, and it will be built in your land." That is, one should not undertake specific actions at present in order to establish an Islamic State, but rather to purify the religion and then to spread this correct understanding of Islam. We may note that together with this quietism, at the center of al-Albani's project is an overriding concern for the purity of the law of God and for resisting its contamination by human ignorance or contrivance. And this sounds rather similar to the project of his great rivals, the Salafī Jihādīs. Well, he had a lot of rivals, but within the Salafī camp, his fiercest rivals, that is the radical Salafīs, the Salafī Jihādīs, the school of Salafism to which Al-Qaeda and ISIS subscribe. The central distinguishing feature of the Salafī Jihādīs, or the Salafī Jihādī school, is their contention that the ruling regimes in the Muslim world are apostate and inherently polytheistic due to their legislating and ruling by man-made law instead of by divine law. The terms that they use are analogous to a true anti-idolatry campaign. In fact, it's not analogous. It is a real anti-idolatry campaign, and they define these forms of government as polytheism, or more accurately, polylatry, as idolatry. And we can trace the genealogy of this notion as it was repurposed from the Middle Ages and then from the 18th century Wahhabi movement, but we'll leave most of that aside for today because for our purposes, the salient point here is the seeming agreement between the Salafī Jihādīs and al-Albani on this point, that one must obey only the law of Allah. But their inflections of the issue differ. Salafī Jihādīs address it at the level of the state, and al-Albani at the individual and social levels, with the law of the state being an issue indefinitely deferred. Now, al-Albani's insistence on sidestepping the issue of state law was at times striking, and I'll mention just two examples. The first concerns a tragic case in Egypt when a man in Alexandria drowned his 2 children in the sea, a case that was heard in 1954. Now, such cases were tried by the national courts, that is, by the man-made law, which at this point was already the Sanhuri Code, but judgments of capital punishment required the authorization of a mufti, and the mufti of Alexandria refused to ratify the capital punishment based on a hadith that reads, La yukadu al-walid bi waladihi. That is, a parent or a father is not to be put to death for their child, that is, for killing their child. The court nonetheless insisted on its original sentencing, and the newspaper Al-Aram published views of leading scholars in support of applying the death penalty in this case, including Mahmoud Shaltut, the leading modernist reformist figure who would in subsequent years be appointed rector of Al-Azhar. And al-Albani did not waste much time on the fact that the Egyptian courts rule by man-made law. He took that as a given. Instead, his response is focused entirely on Shaltut's suggestion that the aforementioned hadith exempting a father from capital punishment for murder of his children may not be authentic. So al-Albani, in his response, which was published in the journal At-Tamadun al-Islami, he protests that one can't do that. You can't just throw out a hadith and say, well, it's not certain. In the past, there were those who challenged its authenticity, so as to get it out of the way, as it were. And I've noticed this in some, let's say Al-Qaradawi, for example. He has a tendency to do something similar. If he wants to rule in one way, then he says, well, this was disputed, so we'll throw it to the side. According to al-Albani, that's not how it works. One must undertake the evaluation, and if one does, one sees that in this case, the hadith is legally valid and applicable. The other example I would bring is a general line of argument in the famous talk where al-Albani, I don't know if it's coined, I don't know if it's the first time that he used it, but when he popularized the slogan, purification and education. This was a talk that was given around the year 1970 in Jordan when he was still living in Damascus. And in that speech, al-Albani notes a positive development in his view that many people have now begun to speak of the need to apply Allah's law and Allah's law alone. And this could plausibly be read as a reference to developments in the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood and elsewhere with Sayyid Qutb and the Qutbist factions that began to arise in Syria and the Gulf countries and so forth. But he alludes specifically to the radical but nonviolent Hizb ut-Tahrir organization, which is of Hanafi allegiance. So there are 4 Orthodox law schools in Sunni Islam, and the Hanafis are one of them. And so instead of al-Albani's almost hadith-only approach, the Hizb ut-Tahrir adheres to traditional Hanafi views and rulings. So al-Albani argues that these people, or Nabhani, the founder himself of Hizb ut-Tahrir, he argues that this person cannot truly promote the aim of exclusive adherence to Allah's law since he doesn't have any idea what Allah's law is. And he brings many examples of this, such as the comparative laxity of the Hanafis regarding alcoholic beverages not made from grapes, and so on and so forth. Strikingly, al-Albani avers in this speech that he sees no difference whatsoever, la farqa, between ruling by modern man-made law and ruling by the law of one of the law schools. As far as he's concerned, this is not Allah's law, and that is not Allah's law. And to understand how striking this is, the Hanafi school was the official school of the Ottoman Empire, and they had rules for how muftis and judges were supposed to apply Hanafi precedent and so forth. So al-Albani does not see any historic change as the Salafī Jihādīs do, and as many others do. He says, well, there wasn't rule of Islamic law before, and there isn't now. If we turn our attention now to the other side, to the Salafī Jihādīs, the upshot of their view is that they consider al-Albani's approach to be a cop-out, in not too many words. Whatever the validity of his arguments, and the radical Salafis do share many of his concerns for purification of the religion from illicit accretions, and some of these first generation of Salafī Jihādi scholars were also students of al-Albani before the lines really set. But those commonalities aside, they look at the outside world and say, well, all of the supposedly Muslim countries of today rule by man-made law invented and adopted by human legislative bodies. I mean, this is explicit from John Locke to modern forms of government that there is a legislative branch. And that is by far their foremost issue. Thus, to invest all of one's time and effort in peaceful purification and education in a pre-modern vein is to be derelict in the immediate duty facing Muslims to make the law of God the sole law applied on earth, and that requires violent revolt to depose the current leaders, whom they consider to be apostates. And from here, we can map out the main topics that serve as fault lines between the two camps. Against the radicals, the Quietists attempt to demonstrate that the rulers are not apostate, but only sinners, even though they rule by man-made law. Okay, and if they are only sinners and not apostates, then one can entertain other considerations, such as al-Albani does, and one doesn't have to go underground and undertake military training and a lot of things that a lot of people don't want to do. So out of the various arguments advanced on this score, I will focus today on one that is especially associated with Al-Albani and his students in particular, and is not actually accepted by all Quietist Salafis, and that is their lenient position on the definition of faith. Now, all the parties to these disputes, since they all define themselves as Salafis, then they concur with the classical formula that was ascribed to the early forefathers, that is the Salaf. Faith is speech and acts, and it increases and decreases. So here, the part that's going to be more important for us today is faith is speech and acts. That is, acts are a part of faith. It is really only the Salafis who continue to champion this ancient tenet, since the predominant schools of Sunni theology throughout the medieval period and down to this day deny that acts are a true and full component of faith. Now, there's an odd tension in this, which I will explain now. The conventional name for the belief that acts are not a condition of faith is irja, which literally means to postpone or to defer. And thus those who hold it are called the Murji'a, which was the name of an early theopolitical sect. And the Murji'a are generally classified by the traditional Sunni doxographers as heterodox. Yet, as I noted, the exclusion of acts from the definition of faith became, through the dominant Ash'ari and Maturidi schools of theology, the default position by far for most Sunni Muslims. So there are ways of explaining this, that the early Murji'a, who were the heterodox, they had some different view, and it wasn't just the exclusion of acts from faith, but that is the basic tension. And it was the principal forefather of today's Salafism, the 14th century Syrian scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, who zeroed in on this disjuncture and argued that this supposedly default position for the Sunnis was in fact heterodox. In this, as in other topics, what the mainstream held as Sunni orthodoxy, Ibn Taymiyyah considered heterodoxy, and vice versa. He spelled out these views in two polemical works. I don't know if he has non-polemical works, but these are definitely polemical works, specifically devoted to the topic of faith and the definition of faith. And these writings by Ibn Taymiyyah, as his writings on other topics, have proven to be extraordinarily influential on present-day debates. Now, so that is, I'll explain just the relevance now. The Salafī Jihādīs, when they hold that acts are a full component of faith, then they will say that the ruler who rules by law other than Allah's law, then he is apostatized through this act. So the operational conflict here is whether it is just the act of ruling by Allah other than Allah's that is apostasy, or whether one requires some additional evidence or indication that the person is an apostate. As for Al-Albani, true to form, he doesn't really go into all of the properly theological argumentation. And he argues instead that he has found a hadith that resolves the issue. And it doesn't really bother him that nobody has advanced the argument that he advanced before him. So while in the modern issue is ruling by other than what Allah revealed, the classical test case for the definition of faith was normally that of prayer and the status of one who abandons praying, tariq salat. And it is through this classic issue that Al-Albani presents his solution. The hadith that he believes resolves the issue is the Allah's freedmen tradition, the essence of which is as follows. On Judgment Day, the Muslims and the angels will plead for various groups of sinners to be extracted from hellfire. So they start from the easiest, and then they get to less and less meritorious people until at last remain only the least meritorious of all. And at this point, Allah says, the angels have interceded, the prophets have interceded, the believers have interceded, there remains the most merciful of all, that is Allah, who then extracts from hellfire people who have never performed a single meritorious act for Allah. Nasan lam yamalu lillahi khayrun qattu, and who are then known as Allah's freedmen, utaka Allah. So thus, according to Al-Albani, this last group of people who never performed a meritorious act in their life, then they certainly didn't pray then. So one who fails to perform the prayer cannot be an apostate solely by dint of his act of omission, otherwise he would never be extracted from hellfire at all. The evidence to the contrary presented by others, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah, should then be interpreted as applying to one who actively rejects the commandment of prayer rather than merely passively failing to uphold it. And then that's not a question of act, that's a question of revealing one's inner belief. If the person who does not pray is reprimanded and fails to heed the reprimand, he becomes thereby a rejecter and apostate due to his rejection and not due to the original act of omission. In the same way, Al-Albani holds that a political ruler only becomes an apostate when he gives some outward sign, some outward indication that he rejects Allah's law or that he prefers human law to Allah's law, not merely when he fails to rule by it and enforce it. And since rulers are not dumb, they generally don't come out and say, well, I don't know if it's not a question of dumb, it's a question of the general conservatism of in Muslim countries today. So you don't really have radical reformers so much, maybe MBS. You have people who come out and say, well, this is consistent, this is consonant with the Sharia. Al-Albani also attempted to claim that his position was concordant with that of Ibn Taymiyyah and the pre-modern Salafī tradition, but his arguments here are tenuous and perhaps even tendentious. In this case, the radical Salafīs, in my estimation, have understood Ibn Taymiyyah quite well and recognized on the basis of Al-Albani's writings that his position is one that Ibn Taymiyyah would have considered a Morjiite position, a heterodox position, which they reject. For them, acts are a true criterion of faith and unbelief, and not, as Al-Albani held, merely a criterion for an additional perfection of belief, that is, istikmal al-iman. So this debate had earlier roots. I mean, in recent decades, it began, this so-called Morjiya debate, in the period in which the radicals were detaching themselves from the mainstream of the Muslim Brotherhood over the course of the later 1960s and 1970s. But in the 1990s, Al-Albani became the lightning rod for criticism, and over the course of a decade or so, this Morjiya debate helped cement the divergence between the Quietist and the radical Salafī camps. So, summing up, we can see that both sides share a zealous concern for exclusive adherence to Allah's law, and that's a principle that's shared by both radical and politically Quietist Salafīs, but receives very different expressions in their respective manhaj of each. That is, manhaj is the manner in which one conducts oneself in the real world in application of the Salafī creed. In the end, we are left with a question of what leads to what. In other words, does each camp just follow the evidence and, as it were, arrive at different conclusions, which is certainly how they present it themselves? Or are they fitting the evidence to a preformed ethos, either a Quietist one or a radical one? So there can be room for discussion, analysis, and even disagreement, but I see it's a big puzzle, but I see all of these things as connected. The divergence in overarching ethos can be seen as typologically significant in itself, and perhaps cannot be totally resolved by reference to medieval sources, since it is only in the modern age, with the spread of explicitly legislative forms of government in the Muslim world, which is one of the main expressions of how modern secularism came to the Muslim world, it is only that which poses these questions in this particular way. As regards the typological observation, I believe that it relates to the general topic of how the mandate of exclusive worship of God and devotion or obedience to him has been interpreted and is interpreted in the Abrahamic traditions. One can think, for example, of the rabbinic dictum that the desire for idolatric worship, for idolatry, ceased after the destruction of the first temple, and thenceforth the principle of devotion to God and exclusivity of one's devotion to God no longer takes the form that it did for in the Deuteronomist period and in the Josianic reform, for example. So due to their theological commitment, Salafī Muslims cannot openly embrace such an overt post-revelational change in the religion, but ultimately an analysis of the divergence between Quietist and radical Salafīs would do well to integrate both the internal Islamic studies analysis, which is the meat of what I have presented today, and also the wider typological one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. And now we will turn to our last speaker for today, who is my colleague in the Department of Middle East Studies, Professor Nimrod Hurvitz, who teaches, as I said, in this department. He's published about Muslim law, courts of law, politics of theology, and modern and medieval socio-religious movements. And he is also a member of the steering committee of the Center for Study of Conversion and Interfaith Dialogue. So please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the organizers for giving me a chance to speak. Thank you for all of you that are still here, sticking with us. Both Daniel and me actually didn't coordinate this, but we're talking about the variations that exist within the Salafī movement, the Salafī camp. Daniel focused on the Quietists, and I will talk about the militants. Shiism and Sunnism evolved side by side during the earliest decades of Islam. The disagreement that set them against each other was who was entitled to inherit Muhammad's political role as leader of the community. Throughout the early centuries, the Sunnis were victorious since they held the reins of power, while the Shi'is mounted repeated challenges through armed rebellion. Over time, this political rivalry gave rise to theological controversy, deepening the animosity between the two camps. From the early era to the present, Sunnism and Shiism have been competing for political and intellectual dominance of the Muslim world. Complicating matters, in many cities, Sunnis and Shiis lived side by side. In light of the tense, at times violent relations between the two communities, this proximity raised urgent questions about how intercommunal relations ought to be regulated. In this lecture, I examined the views and practices espoused by the Hanbalis in the formative centuries of Islam and ISIS in the 21st century. I chose to compare these two movements because each of them espoused the most doctrinally conservative positions of their respective eras. The comparison will highlight three aspects of the Sunnis' views of Shiism. The first, the ideological distance between these conservative currents and the rest of the Muslim community. I will argue that the conservatives stand apart from the mainstream thought within Islam. The gap between legal doctrine and social practice will also come up, and the radicalization of the most conservative currents over time. So let's start with the medieval period in the background. Medieval jurists articulated two positions regarding non-Sunni Muslims, such as Shi'is, Qadaris, Mu'tazila. These are all names of various movements that existed in the first centuries of Islam, whom they considered innovators. One point of view we can call integrationist, viewed them as Muslims who misunderstand certain aspects of Muslim doctrine, but despite their straying interpretations, were members of the Muslim community. Most of the jurists who chose this approach belonged to a number of schools of law, the Hanafi, the Shafi'i, the Maliki, although the Malikis were divided. The second position, that can be labeled as the marginalizing approach, articulated a legal doctrine that constructed what I would call social barriers that ostracized Muslims who strayed from Sunni theological and political doctrine. Jurists who chose this approach were mainly from the Hanbali school and a handful from the Maliki school. So this is the division between the jurists in the Middle Ages. These social barriers were part of the Hanbalis' effort to cleanse Muslim society of what they took to be straying trends of thought. They were comprised of a legal doctrine that limited the participation of these innovators in significant socio-religious activities such as leading prayers. The importance of the religious and moral credentials of prayer leaders has been thoroughly discussed by Muslim jurists. In these discussions, the Hanbalis, who viewed the Shi'is as innovators, refused to allow them the honorable position of leading a prayer. The precise articulation of their doctrine appears in the canonic Hanbali legal text, Al-Hiraki's Mukhtasar, and now I quote, "Someone who prays behind a person who promulgates innovations or is a drunkard must repeat the prayer." Note that Al-Hiraki does not prohibit the act of praying behind an innovator, but rather asserts that such an act is of no religious value and therefore must be repeated. In other words, Al-Hiraki does not call for an outright boycott of the Shi'is, and he does not prescribe confrontational behavior. Furthermore, note that the discussion and sanctions refer to, and I quote again, a person who promulgates innovations. The term promulgates is critical because it distinguishes between well-educated scholars or propagandists who actively disseminate the Shi'i doctrine and ordinary Shi'is who lack that knowledge and therefore merely follow their scholars. We learn about this distinction from numerous recorded conversations between Ibn Hanbal and his disciples. The differentiation between knowledgeable and ignorant Shi'is creates a middle ground, both conceptual and social. The conceptual creates a category of Muslims that combine the essential beliefs of Islam while at the same time embracing mistaken interpretations. The social dimension transforms this theoretical possibility into a concrete social group that is situated between the fully fledged believers and what is called murtads, that's to say, believers that have left the faith or apostates that are not part of Islam anymore. So we have a middle group here that is created in the discussions and in the legal thought of the Hanbalis. Since the vast majority of the Shi'is do not promulgate their beliefs, the insertion of the condition, a person who promulgates, limits the scope of the sanction and suggests that even Hanbal and Al-Hiraki did not aim to clash with the Shi'is. The bottom line of the Hanbali legal doctrine is that they construct social barriers that set boundaries between ordinary Sunni Muslims and what they take to be innovators. However, the sanctions they implement are soft in that they do not lead to all-out boycotts and violence and are limited in the sense that they are not applied to all innovators, but only to the leaders and spokesmen of these movements. Now, in contrast to the Hanbalis and the handful of Malikis that joined them, who espoused a legal doctrine that implemented sanctions on alleged innovators, there's another group that I mentioned before, the Hanafi, Shafi'i, and Maliki jurists who viewed the Shi'is as ordinary believers that espoused wrong interpretations, and therefore it would be inappropriate to apply sanctions on them. Two observations need to be made about the medieval jurists' views regarding social sanctions against alleged innovators. The first is that, with few exceptions, the Hanbalis stand almost alone in their insistence to apply sanctions that would create a social barrier between the alleged innovators and ordinary believers. This is a minority opinion in the Islamic world. The majority says that they should simply be included in the community. The second is that none of the jurists in the first centuries of Islam, including the Hanbalis, argued for the total expulsion of theological innovators from the Muslim community. Rather, even the most antagonistic jurists among the Hanbalis attempted to create a social legal category within Islam that would include innovators while placing them in a separate and lower social legal position. This social legal category is a middle ground, a sort of gray zone that is comprised of non-Sunni Muslims who are tolerated, though they are forced to the margins of Muslim society. Although Islamic legal discourse leans towards tolerance, the chronicles record a different form of behavior on the part of the masses. The historical sources mention time and again popular eruptions of violence and often mention massive Hanbali participation. For example, read about intercommunal strife that occurred throughout the 10th and 11th centuries in Baghdad, in which the Hanbalis burned down parts of the Shia neighborhoods, such as Karh. This is a well-known neighborhood in Baghdad. These outbursts, which contradict Hanbali legal positions, illustrate the gap between law and social conduct. This is one of the points that I wanted to demonstrate in the beginning of this lecture. When we proceed through the later Middle Ages and early modern period era, we come across Hanbali luminaries that have been mentioned by Daniel, such as Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Abd al-Wahhab, who articulated increasingly unforgiving criteria about Shia affiliation in the Islamic community. Finally, in the 20th and 21st centuries, extreme conservatives articulate a zero-tolerance approach to the Shias. In a nutshell, the medieval social barriers are transformed into annihilation. In what follows, I will present how ISIS thinkers articulate their lethal theology. In the Beak, one of ISIS's main propaganda platforms, appears an article about the Shiites, whom ISIS labels as Rafida. The discussion begins with an explanation of the term. Rafida is a derogatory term that goes back to the 8th century. In other words, that was the first times that Muslims used this term in order to describe Shia, certain versions of Shiism, which means rejectors of the Prophet's companions. In their writings, ISIS thinkers go through a list of what they consider the Rafida's ideological and religious misinterpretations and conclude that anyone who embraces those beliefs is not a Muslim. I'll give now 2 examples just to flesh this out. The first Shia aberration, according to ISIS thinkers, is their declaration that the companions of the Prophet are apostates. Such a view is blasphemous, according to them, because the companions of the Prophet play a critical role in establishing the beliefs of Islam. Since they were the Prophet's friends, they knew him best and were able to transmit his sayings and reports about his deeds. This information, what the Prophet said, did, or approved, is called hadith, and is considered one of the 2 foundations of Islamic faith. 2 huge parts of the Sharia, that's the Islamic law, the political ideology, and moral outlook are based on hadith. So by asserting that the companions of the Prophet are unreliable apostates, one demolishes the Islamic faith. To quote the Beak, thus whoever believes that the Sahaba, that's the companions, or majority of them, became fasiqeen, sinners, or mutadin, that's to say apostates, or believes in the right or legality of cursing them. Cursing the Sahaba was something that the Shiites began around the 10th century more and more, and it caused tremendous tensions in Baghdad from the 10th century on. Or legality of cursing them has thereby disbelieved in Allah and his messenger. In other words, has placed themselves outside of Islam. The companions are revered by the Sunnis because many of them were close friends of the Prophet and because they constituted a critical link in the transmission of the Islamic faith to future generations. Therefore, ISIS counters the Rafidi accusation, or the Shia accusation, that they were apostates by accusing the Rafidis themselves of being apostates. So this is like a mutual accusation. Another issue that comes up, or another bone of contention, are the supernatural abilities. This is a theological issue of the 12 imams of the Ithna Sharia. One aspect of such abilities is the notion of intercession and the idea that a dead man or a woman buried in a grave can intercede for them with God. This Rafidi tenet of faith is taken by many conservative Sunnis to be idolatry. It should be noted that this line of criticism has been stated against other Sunnis, not just against Shiis, primarily Sufis, who visited graves with the expectation that the holy man or woman buried in the grave will intercede for them with Allah. And again, I will quote the Beak just to show what their line of thinking is. The Rafida now prostrate to graves and circumambulate them. They supplicate the buried and seek intercession from them. This shirki, or this polytheistic apostasy, is something of which all of them, both their leaders and their laymen, I emphasize, leaders and laymen, are guilty. If this were their only kufr, their only act of apostasy, it would be more than sufficient to declare them all apostates. The essence of this accusation, that's to say that the Rafidis seek intercession from dead men, is put forth quite clearly. Yet, note the writer's emphasis on anyone who seeks intercession, be it a leader or a layman. I emphasize the layman here. He is guilty of being an apostate. In this statement, the author rejects the notion that ignorance can serve as a mitigating circumstance. Mitigating circumstances were an important component in the Hanbali legal view, which distinguished between someone who promulgates innovation and someone who does not. And as we shall see soon, it is also an important element in the thought of certain jihadi thinkers today, such as Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was the second in command in Al-Qaeda until Osama bin Laden was assassinated in 2011, and then he became the leader of Al-Qaeda. So the controversy over the imam's supernatural abilities surfaces again regarding their knowledge and power. The author of the Dabiq article accuses the Rafidis of believing that the imams control atoms, know the unseen, and can abrogate the Quran. Such attributes, he would argue, belong to Allah and to Allah alone. Now I want to bring this debate between the different trends within the jihadi camp. So one of the most interesting disagreements pertaining to the Rafidis is between Zarqawi, who served as the inspiration for ISIS, and Zawahiri. In 2005, after a series of attacks by Zarqawi's followers against the Shias in Iraq, in which they killed hundreds of Shias, including some of their religious leaders, Zawahiri wrote a letter expressing his disagreement with this policy. He wrote this to Zarqawi, and wrote that it is a self-defeating approach. This letter seems to have infuriated Zarqawi's followers, and more than a decade later, in Dabiq, in a volume that was published in 2016, they accused Zawahiri of a deviant belief that they, that's the Rafidis, are Muslims. They made a similar accusation against the Taliban also, who consider the Shias to be Muslims and who claim, I quote, everyone who says there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is Allah's messenger, that's the Shahada, is a Muslim. Furthermore, ISIS admonished the Taliban, who defended the Shias who lived in Afghanistan and who rebuked ISIS for attacking Shia communities. So there is a sort of division here between different groups within the jihadi camps. The ISIS takes the stand that the Shiites are not Muslims, and the rest of them, or Zawahiri and the Taliban, argue that they are. There's one particularly pertinent and interesting point in ISIS's condemnation of Zawahiri, and that is their disapproval of the distinction that Zawahiri makes regarding ignorant and knowledgeable Shias. They cite several of his statements, and now they're citing Zawahiri here. As for those who are ignorant and believe in these false tenets due to hadith, a hadith is the plural of hadith, they thought to be authentic, while the truth had not reached them, or due to them being ignorant laymen, then they are excused due to ignorance. So Zawahiri says this quite explicitly and in several places. As this statement demonstrates, Zawahiri stands in alignment with Ibn Hanbal. Both invoke mitigating circumstances to limit the scope of condemnation and to avoid complete repudiation of the Shia community. I would like to wrap up now by emphasizing 3 points, which demonstrate the fault lines separating conservative Sunnism from the broader Muslim community and the dynamics of conservative radicalization. The views discussed in this lecture are those of the most conservative trends in each era. It is hard to assess the numbers of relative size of these conservative trends, but based on rough assessments, they are the minority opinion. One significant feature of these trends is that they were constantly uncomfortable with the views they staked out and articulated different doctrines over the centuries. The second point, during the first centuries of Islam, the gap between conservative scholars and the rest of the community was not very big. Although the conservatives articulated a legal doctrine that marginalized Shiism by creating a middle category between observant Muslims and apostates, none of the jurists permitted the use of violence against the Shiis. This is, I reiterate, this is in the Middle Ages. At the same time, the lay followers of the Hanbali school of law were much less tolerant and have a history of clashing violently with the Shias. Over time, and particularly during the last decades of the 20th and 21st, last decades of the 20th century and the first decades of the 21st century, the gap between ultra-conservative Muslims and the rest of the Muslims grew. The rejection of the learned, ignorant distinction is precisely what marks the rupture between medieval Hanbali doctrine and ISIS's ideology, and between ISIS and some other jihadist movements today. The degree of tolerance in ultra-conservative thought has narrowed to the point that the middle ground entity has disappeared, and zealous conservatives can now claim there is no gray zone. Thank you.